Grace and peace to everybody out there. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of the Obnoxious Honesty Podcast. It's your host, ChuckintheTruth, and today's subject matter is going to be on avoiding traits of toxic relationships, specifically toxic romantic relationships. Now, I'm a people's first person, and I'm a fairly good listener, so I make friends pretty easily with people, and people tend to not take a whole lot of time being around me to where they get to a certain comfort level of trusting me. And, our friendship, our acquaintance can get, pretty personal. People tend to get comfortable telling me personal information and personal stories. And so, from having that type of personality in myself and having that type of trait, what I have accumulated over all these years is a certain knowledge base and understanding about toxic relationships. I've heard a lot of people talk a lot about toxic traits that either they or their spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend exhibited in a relationship. And I've heard a lot of different stories over the years, and I've had a lot of different conversations over the years. And if you listen to the first episode in this podcast series that I've done, you would remember that I talk about how going through experiences with a purpose and intent to learn will help you to gain a greater knowledge base. And so that's what I've done throughout the years. So I have three different toxic traits that I want to mention today to be aware of in yourself and also in your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, especially if you're in the mindset of eventually marrying that person. So, it's a couple of traits, that foundational toxic traits, that I've come to see is a commonality in a bunch of different relationships with a bunch of different people that I've known about through the years. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background and break it down into a couple of different ways. And then, of course, at the end of the pod, I'm going to connect a few Bible verses to the scenarios so that we can, kind of make some real life situations connect to what, Scripture says. So that's the outline of the pod. I hope you enjoy it. Pretty sure you will. So let's go ahead and get right into it. But first, you know what it is. Let's hit the intro music. I'm trying to be great, and I'm on my way. It's never too late, and I'm on my way. I'ma leave my mark, ready, set, go. Ready, set, go. Ready, set, go. In pretty much every scenario or situation in life, the more experience you have in that situation, or the more times you go through that situation, that helps you to learn, and you eventually become an expert of some sorts, right? You're an expert on certain levels, and that is true in pretty much everything. The more you go through something, the more you learn about it, a particular subject matter or a situation. You go through that over and over again. You start to learn more and more, and you have a knowledge base that tends to usually help you on the other end. In turn, help other people as well. Toxic relationships is one of the few scenarios in life where the more experience you have in them, it actually is not a positive thing. It doesn't mean that you are learning and growing enough. Most likely, because if you were learning and growing enough, you wouldn't keep repeating those same toxic traits, and you wouldn't keep having toxic relationships, specifically maybe attracting a certain type of people, or lending yourself to get into relationships with a certain type of people that may lend themselves to toxic traits in a relationship. Or if you're not learning about your own toxic traits enough and doing something about it. So toxic traits in a relationship is really one of the few situations in life where your wealth of experiences is actually not a good thing, right? It's usually the other way around. Usually, wealth of experience is a good thing. This is particularly not. The reason why I bring that up is because I myself, I've only been in 7 boyfriend girlfriend relationships my whole life. I've only had 7 relationships my whole life, and 6 of those 7 relationships, I seriously thought about a future with that with the woman. So, and now some of those was before I graduated high school, and I know some people, they don't even count relationships, before high school or whatever. People have all kinds of different parameters that they try to use or whatever. But for me, for my intents and purposes, I count any relationship with, someone who I considered my girlfriend at the time, right? People call it whatever, going out with somebody, going steady, being exclusive, whatever you want to call it, right? So I've had 7 of those relationships my entire life. 3 before high school, 2 in high school, actually 1 in middle school that I still count. But again, I know some people don't. But 3 before I graduated high school, and 4 after I graduated high school. And like I said, 6 out of those 7, I seriously thought about a future with the girl. So I have never myself been in a toxic relationship. I don't consider any of those relationships toxic. Now, that doesn't include, other women that I've interacted with through the years that I would consider we had a toxic situation with each other, or toxic experiences with one another. So I just have avoided those women, being my girlfriend at the time, right? So I differentiate that because the point I'm trying to make is the information of toxic traits and relationships that I have compiled over the years is not from specific personal experience. The information that I've compiled has come from seeing and being around toxic relationships with people that I'm close to, telling me about their relationships. And oftentimes, when you're in the relationship, you don't consider that relationship toxic. It takes someone from the outside looking in, like, man, y'all sure go through a lot. Y'all sure, do this a lot. Y'all have these type of negative traits that happen, and they occur oftentimes in relationships. So oftentimes it takes someone from the outside looking in to recognize that. That's what I've done a lot. And so, as I mentioned earlier about being a people's person, and people making friends with me, being able to make friends with people easily, and people tend to trust me, after not too long a period of time, and they start to, tell me personal situation, personal information. That has happened so much throughout my adult life that I have been able to gain a wealth of knowledge of people and their, experiences. Now, I'm not saying I'm specifically unique in that, because I know everybody has friends and family members that they, know about relationships with and all that. But I think what does make my thought process unique, once again, alluding to my first the first episode of the Obnoxious Honesty podcast that I did, I gave you a foundation about my mindset and why I think my mindset is different in terms of learning through experiences and studying people, studying people's brains and behavior, like their psychology. Like, there is a lot of that I've done through the years. And so one of the specific areas that I really think has helped me, and one of the reasons why I believe why I haven't been in a toxic relationship, because I have avoided situations, the foundational kind of toxic traits that I'll be talking about a little bit later on in the pod. I've avoided those things purposely. All right, I have, with great intention, avoided certain toxic traits in relationships because I didn't want to go through that. Right. So, whereas people can go through, multiple relationships over and over, and, have the same type of things happening to them. It's like, do you not learn? Like, do you not understand that you need to change your way of doing things or change your way of thinking so that you don't keep getting in the same type of, relationships that are, dead end and don't really have a future, or, a real future, or maybe you think they do for a while and they don't, or, whatever the case may be. But what I'm trying to get at is understanding of hearing so many different stories, and having like legit counseling sessions with people, in terms of their relationships, and trying to help them. And again, things that I've seen, firsthand, seen and heard firsthand from, close friends and close, family members, and situations like that. And I'll mention a few of those types of scenarios that I've been through the years, that I've heard and learned about and known about. But I just wanted to kind of clarify before I start, the fact that I haven't been in what I would consider a toxic relationship, or I haven't been in a relationship that either me or the woman was showing consistent toxic traits over and over again. That's a plus, right? Once again, this is not a scenario where much experience is actually a good thing. This is a scenario where much experience is a bad thing, especially if you're not learning enough to change your habits to where you don't keep going through them, right? So the purpose of this part is how to avoid those traits, how to avoid them in yourself, and how to avoid them in your spouse or your significant other. Now, there's three types of relationship combinations that there can be, in terms of the two people involved, right? So you can either have a relationship where both people are naturally givers. You can have a relationship where one person is more of a giver and the other person is more of a taker. And then you can have a relationship where both people are more naturally takers. All right. So you can have two givers, two takers, or one of each. Right. So those are three different combinations of types of relationships that you can have. Right. And in this particular thing that I'm gonna kind of get into a little bit, the first thing I want to be clear on is any of those types of combinations of relationships you can make work, right? There is other types of personality traits that go into whether someone is a giver or a taker in a relationship. Now, there's other personality types that go into that. And so, because of those other types of personality traits, you can make any type of those combinations work depending upon your and your significant other's personality types, right? So, the point is understanding which you are in terms of a giver or a taker, understanding which your spouse or significant other is, being able to recognize that, and communicate together with how that happens and the occurrences that happen in your relationship. Now, let me give you an example. Dr. Gary Chapman came up and made this thing popular about the five love languages, right? And he kind of broke down how people have a combination of these, and some people are more one than the other. So we know it's words of affirmation, physical touch, quality time, acts of service, and receiving gifts. Those are the five ways that people give and receive love. So, in terms of whether you're a giver or a taker, you have to know how to love your spouse or significant other in their love language. One of the biggest issues that people do is they love in their love language, in either not knowing or recognizing what your other person's love language is, or just overriding what their love language is in preference of your own. So the other person may enjoy acts of service more in terms of accepting that love language, but maybe you just want to do receiving gifts, which would be giving gifts. So you want to give gifts as your love language, and they actually prefer acts of service. So that's kind of there's a difference. There's a way that you cannot actually do what you think you're doing in terms of benefiting the relationship and making the other person feel loved, because you're not loving them the right way. You're not loving them in their love language. And when you're not loving your spouse or significant other in the proper love language, then they start to feel not as appreciated. And so when someone's not feeling appreciated in the relationship, that goes hand in hand with not feeling loved. And not feeling appreciated or loved in a relationship, those feelings start to build up and they start to get worse and worse over time. So if you don't deal with it, then it's just going to blow up. Now, when two people in a relationship are both naturally givers and they just focus on giving for the other and doing things for the other, then that tends to be the best type of relationship, because both of them are selfless and both of them are focused on each other. So instead of each focusing on yourself, when you're each focusing on the other, how can I love the other person? How can I serve the other person? How can I make the other person feel special, make the other person feel good? When both people are doing that, then neither of them are lacking. The second type of relationship combo is the one giver, one taker. Now, this type of relationship combo, this often works because it's kind of like a natural fit. Like one person, is more inclined to giving while the other person is more inclined to taking. And so, you have a point where the giver in the relationship tends to be low maintenance. So, they're the type of person where you ask them what they want, or, if you can get them something, and they never give you a good answer because they don't particularly think about themselves. That's how my wife is. My wife, she really does not want anything. If I ask her, hey, you want me to get you something, or, get this or get that or do this or do that, she's like, I'll get it myself. I'll do it myself. Like, that's her first thought is that. And it's not like a negative to where, me not giving her things constantly or doing things for her constantly. She doesn't take it as a negative because that's not something that's just big to her. So once again, depending on the personality traits of you and your partner is the success rate of your relationship, your marriage, or whatever it is, based off of the combination of giver taker, or taker. Now, the last type of relationship combo, two takers in a relationship, that's very difficult to make work. Once again, you can make it work. You can make all three of these combinations work, but that one's a little bit more difficult. Sometimes that type of relationship can seem to be a little bit more transactional in terms of, hey, I do this for you, and so I want you to do this for me. Right? It seems a little bit transactional, and oftentimes it's more difficult to make that type of relationship work because the communication styles may be lacking. And so you can be expecting someone to give you certain things and they don't. And that leads you right back to the problem of feeling less appreciated, feeling less loved. And once you're feeling a lack of appreciation, lack of love in a relationship, then things start to go downhill from there. So those are the three relationship combination types that you need to be aware of. So first way to avoid toxic traits in a relationship is understanding what kind of relationship you have in the first place. Do you have a relationship where you both are givers? Do you have a relationship where one's more naturally a giver and the other's more naturally a taker? Or do you have a relationship where both are takers, both are more naturally takers? So you got to understand that first for yourself and for your spouse or significant other. Now, my personality is more naturally leading to being a problem solver and a mediator. That's kind of what my personality just generally tends to lean towards. And once again, alluding to my first part I did, I go in detail about that. So, not to dig too deep into that, but again, just mentioning that because I think it's applicable for what I'm about to talk about next when I mention the three specific foundational toxic traits that I have seen over and over again. Now, most business industries like to use different consultants. And so, what you'll have for a business consultant, there are people who they go around to, certain businesses in a specific, area, or they have a particular knowledge or expertise, and they go around to different businesses and they recognize issues, and they recognize, like, how the issues can be fixed, and they generally help with a project going on at that business, or they'll leave that business with, like, hey, these are my findings of my research that I did on your business while I was here and interacting with people and learning and studying. These are some of the problems that y'all have in y'all processes, and these are the ways that these problems can be fixed. So that's pretty much generally what business consultants do. Likewise, there's marriage counselors, right? Marriage counselors, they pretty much are business consultants. They do the same thing. They listen to and study and figure out, a situation that they're not in personally themselves, but they've gone through a field of study and they have an expertise and a wealth of knowledge accumulated that lends them to help people to understand things better, even though the couple, they're the ones in the relationship, and marriage counselor is coming from the outside looking in and trying to help them to do better on the inside looking out. So marriage counselors and business consultants are the exact same thing. Now, why do I bring that up? That is my parallel to what I have done throughout my years of learning and studying and talking to people about their relationships that I alluded to before. So, I've had a lot of coworkers through the years that I have drawn up friendships with, and I've heard a lot of stories about toxic traits in relationships. I have had family members, different relationships in my family, different parts of my family that I've known that people have had failed marriages, and there's different types of traits that came out. And again, those traits that I have seen overall tend to have a commonality between them all. And that's what I want to get into in terms of discussing how to avoid those toxic traits. So here they are. Three foundational toxic traits that I have seen through the years: selfishness, bad communication, and improper imitation or improper emulation. Those are the three that I have seen time and time again: selfishness, bad communication, and improper imitation or improper emulation. So earlier I mentioned the different types of relationship combos, right? Now, when it comes to selfishness, the reason why knowing which type of relationship you're in terms of two givers or two takers or one giver, one taker, is because selfishness is one of the main traits of a toxic relationship that shows itself over and over again. And basically, it's just can be broken down into: are you more focused in a relationship of getting something out of a relationship or putting something into a relationship? Like, if you're married, do you think, what am I getting out of this relationship? What's the benefit that I'm receiving from being in this relationship, being in this marriage? What am I getting out of this? If you're more focused on what you're getting out instead of what you're putting in, you might be the taker in the relationship. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. But if you're in combination with the giver and they're focused more on giving, then once again, that type of combination works a lot. But you gotta know what type of relationship you're in. Because if you're just focusing on what you're getting out the relationship and you're not focusing more on what you're putting into the relationship, like, how you gonna get money out the bank if you didn't put money in the bank?
That isn't the right logic.
Like, it just doesn't make any sense. You gotta think things through. When you are in a relationship, specifically in a marriage that I've seen, the selfishness in the marriage, it just blows my mind. Because marriage is literally signing a contract to be committed to someone. And so the fact that you would sign a contract and then still be selfish and still be focused more on what you want to get out of the relationship instead of what you're putting into the relationship, putting into the marriage, that just doesn't make any sense to me. That's just the craziest thing in the world to me. We understanding as people, we know what type of selfishness we can show. If you're not understanding that in yourself, if you're not paying attention to it and being aware of it in yourself, generally you're going to be led to be selfish, because it takes effort to not be selfish, especially if you happen to be the taker in the relationship. Being selfish is just kind of a little bit more natural. Again, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not trying to say that makes you a bad person and you're so terrible. What the point I'm trying to make is, you have to know what type of relationship you're in, what type of marriage you're in, so you can move forward. If one's a giver and one's a taker, that's fine. You need to understand that, so that moving forward, you have a better shot of not letting things fester and things not getting out of control in terms of how you're treating one another and what you're expecting from one another. What are your expectations in this marriage? What's your expectation for your husband? What's your expectation for your wife? And if they're not meeting the expectations that you had in your mind, but you didn't communicate those expectations to them, how you expect them to even match up to that?
That's so whack.
Because it's bad enough when one person is displaying selfishness in a marriage, but man, when both people are displaying selfishness in a marriage and both people are only focused on what they want in a relationship, what they're getting out of the relationship, what they're getting out of the marriage, when you have that with both people, then you're just really setting yourself up for failure, even more so than other type of relationship combos. So selfishness, that it kind of goes without saying almost, but it has to be said. Because so many people actually still just can display this selfishness. It's almost like subconsciously. It's almost like they don't do it on purpose, but it happens over and over and over again. So once again, the way I like to try to break that down mentally is just, are you more focused in your marriage on what you're getting out of it or what you're putting into it? That's kind of the most basic foundational way I can think about how to combat the selfishness that could occur, in terms of selfishness being one of those foundational toxic traits in a marriage. You can't allow that to continue to happen. In terms of, first, for yourself, if you're doing that to your spouse, and of course you as the spouse not allowing your other spouse to do that to you. There's one person I know, they married a spouse who was previously married and divorced, and they had a child from their first marriage. And so the person I know, they got married to this other person who had a previous child. This person I know didn't allow themselves to not be selfish in their marriage, so much so that they start competing with the child. They're competing with the other person's child that they already had. And instead of just accepting that other child as their own. Now the person I know, they say that with their mouth, that they accept the child as their own, but their actions speak louder than words. One instance in particular that this person I know told me was that they get mad at their spouse for helping their child do homework for too long, and for watching a movie with the child when the child comes over for visitation rights every other weekend. The person I know would actually get mad at the child, so much so that they said they would stay in their room. They would stay in their bedroom and sleep more frequently when the child came over for his visitation rights, because they kept getting mad at how much their spouse was spending time with the child on the weekends that they had visitation. Like, come on. Like, where's the reason? Where's the logic? It doesn't make any sense. But they didn't see a problem with that, because they were that selfish, toxic trait. They were so selfish. They were only focusing on what they could get out the marriage, what they were receiving, what they were getting, how they were feeling, and they didn't stop and think, wait a minute, I'm competing with a child for my spouse. I am avoiding interacting with a child because I get mad at my spouse for them interacting with their child the 2 weekends out the month that the child comes to visit. But the person I know was not able to see their own selfishness in that act. The fact that they were competing with the child, the fact that they were getting mad at the spouse over the spouse interacting with their child. Like, it's crazy when you break it down and think about it. But once again, if you don't see it in yourself, then you're not going to do anything to change. You don't see a problem with how you're acting and what you're doing. But that is just what selfishness does. It focuses on self, only what you want, and it overrides what other people want or desire. So instead of the spouse, instead of the person I know thinking that, hey, it's a good thing that my spouse is actually wanting to spend quality time with their child. Hey, how about I do everything I can to join in and make this feel like one big happy family? But no, 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 no. The person I know, they continue to allow this divide to happen between them and their spouse's child, and it's just they don't even allow themselves to see their own selfishness in that.
Wow, that's so crazy.
So yeah, even though it's easier said than done, the simple way to avoid that selfishness in a relationship, and specifically in the marriage, is understanding that you should be more focused on what you're putting in to the marriage than what you're getting out of the marriage. Now, the second foundational toxic trait that I have seen in relationships is bad communication. Oh man, I could have just had the entire episode of this pod talking about all the different times where bad communication has shown itself in marriages, and how much of a downfall and how toxic bad communication is and can be. So again, as I mentioned earlier, with the three different types of relationship combos, you can make any of them work. It just matters how well your communication is. So remember, I mentioned that you got to be able to communicate with your spouse, and so you understand which you are in the marriage, what type of marriage you're in terms of what combination you are with giver, taker, or giver and taker. Bad communication and not understanding that and talk about that in the first place, that leads to things starting to get out of hand in terms of not communicating with each other to where each spouse feels heard. Like, you ever hear two people get into an argument and they're both yelling, or you've ever been in an argument with someone and you're both yelling? If you're both yelling, neither of you are listening. No one's actually trying to listen to what the other person is angry about, understand their perspective, get their side of it, and then try to internalize that, maybe, relate to it so that they can then in turn try to give a positive answer and have a good outcome for why this other person was mad, and how you'll be able to try to help them not be mad anymore. Instead of that, then one person is yelling so they can be heard, and then the other person starts yelling so they can be heard. Now you just got two people yelling, trying to be heard, And neither of them is getting heard because no one's focusing on actually listening to the other. Each are focusing on only getting out their point of view instead of understanding the other person's point of view. And it just doesn't make any sense. There's a scenario I know where I'm gonna say spouse A and spouse B. So spouse A is the spouse that I know of that's told me the story. So spouse A a while ago decided to try to eat healthier and lose some weight. Both spouse A and B were a bit overweight, and so spouse A decides they wanted to try to get healthier. So spouse A started trying to eat healthier and go to the gym, and started going to the gym after they got off work. Now spouse B got off work before spouse A, and this couple they have two children. So spouse B would get off work first and get the kids home or whatever, and then spouse A would get off work a little bit later and then go to the gym. Now, once again, this is just when they started trying to, get a little bit healthier. So a couple of weeks go by, and spouse A, they get spouse B to go to the gym with them. So what happened was spouse B, like I said, would get off work first. So when spouse A would get off work, spouse A would call spouse B, be like, "Hey, you ready to go to the gym?" Spouse B be like, "Yeah," and then be like, "All right." Then they come drive together and go to the gym, work out together, whatever, whatever. So that only lasted for about 2 weeks. So midway through the third week, one day, spouse A calls spouse B, just like they were doing for the previous 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Spouse A called spouse B and was like, "Hey, you ready to go to the gym? I'm off work." Spouse B flips, starts cussing and yelling about, I don't, you all you talk about is going to the gym. I don't care. I don't want to go. You this, you that. And spouse A is like, what is wrong with him? This has been our habit for the last couple of weeks. I thought we were building, good habits together, and now you're just totally flipping on me. Now, that's a very easy scenario to recognize bad communication. But in a very real sense, one of the main things that people ignore with bad communication is to just speak nicely to your spouse. Like it sounds so simple to where it's stupid, but it's really true. And time again, I have seen and heard example after example after example of spouses just not talking nice to each other, just not being nice to each other, and thinking that it's okay to blow up at the other one or yell at them or belittle them or demean them, and speak rude to them, and they just go on about the business like that's all okay. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, depending on other types of personality traits, you can make any marriage last. You can make any marriage work. But how fulfilling is that going to be for both parties? How much love is going to be included in that for both parties? You have to, take account of all of those things as well. That has to matter. I know one scenario of a couple who's been married for quite some time now, and one of the spouses just constantly down talks and demeans the other spouse, and the spouse that takes the verbal abuse, they just take it, and they've got to the point where it's not even a big deal to them anymore. Now, that's a perfect scenario that I was talking about earlier, where the different types of personality traits that are in the relationship combination, that matters, because some people can deal with being demeaned and belittled and talked to rude, and some people can't, and some people just won't. They will not stand for that. So those things matter as well. But again, in terms of the foundational principle, it sounds so simple, and it actually sounds kind of stupid because it's so simple. But yeah, just don't be rude to your spouse. Try not to be rude to your spouse. Try not to say mean things. Try not to belittle them. Try not to demean them. Try not to boss them around. Try not to treat them like an employee. It seems so simple, but time and time again, people mess it up and they don't do it. And now, lastly, the third foundational toxic relationship thing that I have seen the occurrence is improper imitation or improper emulation, meaning one or both of the spouses is trying to mimic other relationships that they have seen. Oftentimes, they are trying to recreate their parents' marriage that they saw day in, day out growing up. Or, maybe there's another marriage that someone knew about growing up or saw that they thought was just such a great marriage and they held it in the high esteem. So they want to emulate that marriage. That is a slippery slope. And again, throughout my experiences, time and time again, I've seen how that has caused marriage after marriage to fail because not communicating properly with your spouse, as I just mentioned, that looks like things in so many different areas. So not just being rude and belittling them in terms of bad communication, but also bad communication in terms of not setting the right type of expectations moving forward for what your marriage is going to look like. How many times, if you're married, how many times have you thought about you having conversations with your spouse about their parents' marriage, about each other's parents' marriage, and what you saw, what you didn't see. And then a lot of times, of course, people's parents weren't married, and so one person may have grown up with just one parent, one or the other, and so they didn't even have anything to go off of. So maybe they went off of, another marriage that they saw, and maybe since it wasn't their parents, then they didn't see as much of it. Like, for example, myself, my parents, got divorced when I was, I believe, 8 or 9 years old. So I didn't have that as an example. So the other marriages that I did see as an example, I saw a lot less of them because I didn't live with them day in, day out. So the times that I did see them on holidays where other family members were around and everything, I didn't get a true snapshot of what their marriage was. And so I just thought it was all good and it looked a certain way, but there was only but so much that I was ever going to see in that context. So there's a lot of people like me that grew up with one parent and didn't even have that example to be seen in the home. So they looked after examples that they saw outside the home, which is always going to be more artificial than an example inside the home. Now, remember the story of the spouse A, spouse B I told you about with the gym? So that same exact marriage, they have a situation where spouse B, the one that blew up at spouse A like that, spouse B tries to emulate their parents' marriage. Now, their parents have been married for, I think, about over 30 plus years. Or, almost 40, because this particular spouse B is almost 40. So, their spouse B's parents has been married for about 40 years. And so, in spouse B's mind, hey, this marriage worked. This marriage has lasted, so I'm going to emulate this marriage. But the problem is, spouse B's parents is not their spouse, is not spouse A. Meaning, and so I'm trying to stay gender neutral, so I'm not going to specify which parent it is of spouse B. But spouse B has one parent that constantly would belittle and demean the other parent. And so spouse B grew up seeing this example, seeing this marriage last throughout all these decades, and thinking, this is okay. This is acceptable. So I can emulate this when I get married. And spouse A that I know, they ain't about that. They not gonna let you just talk to them all kind of way. And so this particular couple, they are in the midst of starting the process of getting divorced. And one of the reasons, now there's other reasons, of course, but one of the main reasons is this poor communication style because spouse B is trying to emulate their parents' marriage, where one of the parents was consistently verbally abusing the other parent. And so spouse B grew up seeing this, and now they've got to the point where they've been married for 40 years, and that spouse B's parent, who gets belittled and demeaned, verbally abused, they got health issues out the yin yang, which is oftentimes certain ones are caused directly from stress. They're stress related, and that stress generally comes from the way their spouse is treating them and the toxic nature of their marriage. A lot of that stress comes from that, because again, when you are in a marriage, like I mentioned earlier, you signed the contract to be committed to that person. And so why in the world would you do things to negatively influence the person that you literally signed a contract to be committed to? Like that's just so stupid that you would not do everything in your power to look out for this person and to build them up and to encourage them and edify them and hype them up. Like why not?
That isn't the right
But
logic.
not only why not, what's the benefit of not doing that? It just, like, it doesn't make any sense. What is the benefit of not doing that? What is the benefit of belittling your spouse and demeaning them and verbally abusing them? Like, why is that more benefit than building them up and lifting them up and speaking life into them? It's actually not. There actually is none. And generally, people don't have that type of self-awareness and that thought process to even go through. So they don't think to themselves, hey, yeah, I think my spouse is actually benefiting from me belittling them and talking down to them and verbally abusing them. No one. I think it's very, very rare, probably impossible, for someone to actually think, oh, this is good, this is good, this is fine, this is acceptable, and they actually would prefer me to talk down to them like this than to build them up and encourage them. Now, there may be a very small minority where that actually may be true. There may be spouses that think that or do that, but it's actually just not really something that people purposely and intentionally think about. And again, if you're not purposeful and intentional in going through specific experiences and learning specific lessons to be able to apply them to yourself, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And even though I didn't mention the genders in that my last example of that marriage, I actually know of a completely different set of a marriage couple with the exact same situation where the genders are separate. So basically, I know a marriage where there's a wife whose husband is trying to emulate his parents' marriage, and I know of a situation where a husband whose wife is trying to emulate her parents' marriage. And in both of those scenarios, they're literally like the exact same scenario in terms of one situation, it's the spouse's father who verbally abused the mother, and then the other situation is the spouse's mother who verbally abused the father. So I literally know a scenario where both situations are the exact same, but the genders are flipped, and it's still the same outcome. That other couple, so I mentioned spouse A and spouse B, and so that other couple that I know that mirrors the same situation, they're now getting a divorce too. And again, one of the reasons is because of that spouse trying to emulate their parents' marriage. In the other setting of the couple that I know, that this other way this person's trying to emulate their parent is they are constantly just like wanting to hang out with their friends, and there's more emphasis on keeping strong friendships over keeping a strong marriage. And that's just, again, that leads to even the selfishness that I talked about earlier. So these three foundational toxic traits, there's a lot of actually interwoven and overlapping with one another in terms of selfishness leads to bad communication and emulating improperly imitating or emulating your another relationship or another marriage. So these things actually kind of go together sometimes, but it all leads to negativity. It all leads to situations where it's not going to be fulfilling and beneficial in your marriage to do those things. So that's why there should be a premium focused on each spouse individually, trying to recognize these toxic traits, trying to avoid displaying them, and avoiding accepting that behavior from their spouse. Because specifically with verbal abuse, it's very few people that won't escalate a situation when they're attacked verbally or when someone starts yelling at them. Specifically, if your spouse is yelling at you, it is very few people that are actually able to take someone yelling at them without yelling back. And that tends to lead to more negativity and more toxic issues and toxic traits that show themselves in the marriage, in the relationship. Because as hard as it is to actually stay calm and stay quiet when someone's yelling, that is one of the best ways to help them to get them to stop yelling. If they're yelling their heart out and you are not like matching that energy and yelling back, eventually they're gonna stop yelling because they realize they're just arguing with themselves. And coupled along with that, when someone's yelling, actually, it's even though it's hard, even though it's easier said than done, it's actually important to listen to what they are saying. Even though they're yelling, even though they're saying it in a way you may not like it, try to actually listen to what they're saying and don't listen to respond, listen to understand. I'll go back to my example of the argument or the with the gym that spouse A and spouse B went through. So when spouse B started yelling at spouse A about going to the gym, and spouse A stayed quiet and basically just let spouse B yell, spouse A, if they had a thought to themselves, okay, let me listen to why this is such a hot button topic, why my spouse blew up with me at me for something that we have been doing for several weeks now. There's a couple of things that could have led to it, right? Usually, when people blow up like that and start yelling, specifically at a scenario that seems kind of trivial, right? It's usually because of pent up frustrations that have been building for some time. It may be pent up frustration building from the same scenario, like this, spouse B, they weren't the one that wanted to start eating healthy and losing weight. That was spouse A. So spouse B, they probably were thinking to themselves, here I am sacrificing for them, trying to do something with them just so we can spend more time together. Spouse B could have, got in their perspective, they were mad that spouse A was spending less time home for work. So spouse B is like, I already get home first, and I had the kids, and so instead of you coming straight home, you're spending time at the gym, which lessens time where you're with me and our two children. So spouse B, they probably are having this pent up frustration where they're thinking they're justified in their anger. While spouse A, because there was a lack of communication, spouse A doesn't even know that this frustration was building. So that's another thing that is important for us to realize is that when an issue is building and you're feeling pent up frustration building, that needs to be communicated, that needs to be dealt with. And so that way you don't get triggered by something that's more trivial or not as important, because then the other spouse is going to get lost in the trivial nature of what caused the blow up, as opposed to focusing on the background issues that started the blow up, that were building up in the first place before the blow up. So you gotta try to be aware of that on both sides, no matter what side you're on. Whether it's you feeling like things are building up, if you feel like things are starting to build up, you gotta communicate that to your spouse. You gotta be able to say, "Hey, this is bothering me. This is an issue." And then likewise, on the other end, you gotta be able to be aware of if something is building up with your spouse. So you asking them, hey, is there a problem, is something going on? And oftentimes that will be able to lead to the proper communication happening. So now you're combating that before it blows up, before it becomes an even bigger issue. Because one of the saddest truisms of life is that most murders happen between people who know each other. And when there is a spouse that is murdered, their spouse is generally the first suspect, the one that the law enforcement starts to think about first, as the first subject is going to be, hey, it probably was the spouse. Oftentimes that happens. There's all these, true crime shows out there where oftentimes it's the spouse or the significant other that killed someone, or it's a co-worker, it's a business partner, it's some other family member. That is a lot of times what happens. It's crazy as it sounds. That, once again, it's just one of the saddest realisms and truisms of life. We're more likely to get murdered by someone we know than by, a random stranger. So in a real serious way, catching these issues building up and avoiding toxic traits in relationships could actually save your life. One of my favorite phrases that I heard a long time ago says, if you don't heal, you will bleed on people who didn't cut you. If you don't heal properly, if you don't heal, you will bleed on people who didn't cut you. Meaning you will act out on someone who doesn't deserve it, who wasn't really the direct focus of where your anger was. And in marriages, that happens a lot of times in two ways. It's either outside circumstances where, like, stresses of the job, of your job or career, or stresses outside your marriage, you tend to take out those stresses on your spouse. That happens a lot of times. Or even worse, another way that happens a lot is like childhood traumas that were never properly dealt with and properly communicated and talked about. I mean, there's so many people walking around here that needed to have, psychiatrists or some type of counseling for their mental health because of traumas that they faced in their childhood that they never actually dealt with. And so they carry those traumas with them. And then eventually, through a course of time and action, they blow up at their spouse, or they take out anger on their spouse that it isn't really warranted. Or worst of all, what happens is a spouse unknowingly triggers trauma from their other spouse that happened to them earlier, that they either may not be aware of or weren't aware that it was as serious as it was, or it was as important as it was. That happens a lot of times as well. So if you don't heal, you will bleed on people that didn't cut you. I happen to think we actually just saw that last week with Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars. I feel like he was bleeding on someone who didn't cut him. Because, I mean, when you think about the fact that through the past couple of years, the type of information that has gotten out about Will and Jada's marriage, in terms of them being in an open marriage or open relationship where, other people are a part of their sex life. And then you have, his wife talking about in another instance where, their physical intimacy was boring. It wasn't exciting to her. And then she, talks about her deep love that she had had for a man that died 25 years ago, and how that love for him was different than her love for Will. And then, of course, the adultery that she did, that she tried to dress up by calling it entanglement. No, adultery is the right word, right? And even if they were leading towards divorce or separation, they weren't there yet, right? And so, that got all out in the open. So you got all those things that, Will had been through in the public eye, all that kind of drama, all those toxic traits that were weighing on him, and then that information getting out for public consumption. Man, I feel like that was like a breaking point. Chris saying that joke, he felt like he had to do something, to have this grand gesture to Jada. So that was a situation where I think, he bled on someone who didn't cut him. Like, yeah, Chris said the joke, that was inappropriate. But again, like I was mentioning earlier, oftentimes we will like overreact, or we'll get triggered from other traumas. So, I feel like, this is my opinion, obviously, this is my pod. The way that happens when we can get triggered from something, even if it's smaller or bigger, we have these undealt with traumas that we are carrying. And if we're not self-aware and paying attention to how we can, overcome those things and heal from those things, it can lead to a bunch of other negativity in our life, not just in our marriages, and other relationships or friendships and other areas in our life as well.
He's out of line, but he's
All
right.
right, so finally, let me give you a few scriptures that connects to what I was talking about today. Romans 12 verses 9 and 10 is a very good passage to know in order to avoid toxic traits in relationships. It says, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Stay away from what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to each other with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another." Now, there's a lot to unpack in that right there. So the first part about let love be without hypocrisy, the idea of being a hypocrite, the definition of the word, it really carries with it the idea of play acting, meaning literally an actor in a play, a thespian. You're playing a specific role. So you're doing one thing, but you're actually something else. So that's what being a hypocrite really is. The definition of the word. So it says, let love be without that. Let love be without play acting, meaning let your love be genuine. Love needs to be genuine, needs to be real, it needs to be from the heart. So that completely absolves selfishness. The first toxic trait that I mentioned, selfishness has to be taken out the equation. Love has to be genuine. Love can't be focused on self. There's also another verse, 1 Corinthians 13:5, that says love does not behave rudely, does not seek its own. So that whole idea about being selfish, love does not seek its own. So you shouldn't be, this selfishness is really out the equation. Now, getting back to the Romans, stay away from what is evil and cling to what is good. That kind of speaks for itself. And then in verse 10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. So give preference to the other. Once again, that takes selfishness out the equation. And then when it comes to bad communication, I think about Colossians 4:6 that says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." When you think about seasoned with salt, that gives flavor to things, that preserves things. That's the metaphor given here to describe what our words should do to others. So when you are giving words to others, and mind you now, this context isn't even talking just about, marriages. Like the part I've been talking about is that, but this specific verse, this Bible verse is not only talking about that. This is just in general how we should be treating people, right? This is just people in general. This is everyone. This is not just your spouse. It's not talking about that context. And so what makes it so amazing here is that if this is just supposed to be how we're supposed to be treating anyone, treating everyone, why don't we start with our spouses, our significant others, the people we're in a relationship with, that we're moving towards marriage with? That's the end goal, right? That's the audience that I'm talking to. Those are the people I'm talking to. That's what the focus should be on. If we are supposed to be living this way, and just with everyone, then we should practice the most in terms of this love and this great speech being seasoned with salt. We should practice that the most with the people we love the most, our spouses. And then finally, the improper imitation comes from trying to imitate anybody except Christ. Ephesians 5, the last section of the chapter, verses 22 to 33, that gives instructions to both the husbands and the wives. But the key in on verse 25, where it says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her." So Christ is our example, and he sacrificed for the church, which is his bride, and he gave himself for her. So that's the way we are supposed to be imitating. That's who we should be imitating Christ, sacrificing for ourselves. That's what love is. Love is giving. Love is sacrificing. Love is not selfishness. So instead of imitating or emulating, our parents' marriage or another marriage that we think is so great, we should be trying to emulate Christ's marriage to the church, where he gave himself for his wife. Alright, so that is gonna be it for me. Thank you so very much for joining me today. I really hope today's episode was beneficial and encouraging to you, and I hope that it will help you in your relationships, or wherever you're at in your relationship, whether you're already married, whether you're with someone who you think you're going to be married to and want to be married to, or whatever the case may be. I hope this episode helps you. I hope this information helps you in how to avoid toxic traits, both in yourself and not displaying those, and in your significant other and your spouse not accepting those toxic traits. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. Grace and peace. And until next time, I'm out.